It's become one of the unlikeliest forces in gaming, a genre that came from nowhere with no corporate backing, no advertising campaign, and no business model. It's worth millions of dollars, yet only a handful of studios have done any work with it. It's a genre, except it's a game, except there are dozens of them, except it's just a mod. It's a brand new word, except it's an acronym that's trying to be trademarked by its founder, except there is no founder. It's been called MOBA. It's been called Action RTS. But to the millions of gamers around the world who play it, it's just Dota. And now, everybody from the enthusiasts who made it to the biggest companies in gaming are trying to seize control of something that began as a StarCraft map that nobody played. Since much of what follows was never documented at the time it was made, some of the early history here is somewhat vague, or passed by word of mouth through the community. What is known is that the entire phenomenon can be traced back to a user-generated map from Blizzard Entertainment's hugely popular StarCraft. StarCraft itself was a seminal real-time strategy game, in which players must harvest resources to build bases and produce units that they can command against enemy players. But one player decided to change things up a bit. Modifying or modding the game into a custom map, he created a streamlined version of the StarCraft experience. Taking out all of the resources and base building, he focused the game down to a handful of powerful units. A few players would form a team, take control of the character of their choice, and then assault the opposing team, which was controlled by the computer. Each team would have a single structure at their base. The goal was simple: to destroy the other team's structure. However, supporting both teams would be endless waves of computer-controlled units, making just a few players feel like they were fighting alongside great armies. And that was basically it. In many ways, the gameplay of this custom map, called Aeon of Strife, was closer to that of an action role-playing game, much like Blizzard's own Diablo series. The innovation was to map that gameplay into a competitive format, with RTS-scale battles thrown in. The custom map found a small audience, but left no lasting impression on the community. In 2002, Blizzard released their newest RTS game, Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos. Not too long afterwards, Aeon of Strife fans decided to recreate the mod in Warcraft's engine. One of these modders, who went by the name of Eel, called his particular variant Defense of the Ancients, or Dota for short. The switch to Warcraft allowed for the classic Strife gameplay to be improved a bit. For one thing, the hero characters that the gamers played as could now level up as the round progressed, meaning they could unlock better abilities and powers over time. This gave the match a more dynamic feel. Dota's players could further customize their heroes with items, allowing for players to try out wildly different combinations and styles from round to round to round. Dota, like Aeon of Strife before it, found a dedicated audience, although only a small one. Then in 2003, Blizzard released an expansion pack to Warcraft 3 called The Frozen Throne. Critically, with the expansion, they also released a more powerful world editor for modders to play with. Armed with this tool, the Dota fanbase began making a myriad of variants and offshoots from the original Dota. Eventually, there were tons of good Dota games, each with its own set of distinct hero characters. So one modder, going by the name of Mian, decided to simply collect all the best heroes together into one mod that he called Defense of the Ancients All-Stars. This was meant to be a kind of best-of mod with nothing really new of its own. It appears this was the extent of Mian's ambitions. His work complete, he moved on. But yet another player/modder wasn't satisfied. Steve Feek, who went by the name Ginsu, wanted to rebalance the game to be more fun. He always thought that the Dota game style was a great idea that had never been refined enough. So that he and his buddies could have a good time, he began to tweak the Dota All-Stars mod and put them up on the internet for public use. Keep in mind, the only way to play any of these mods was to find them on the internet, download them, install them correctly, and then play them through the Warcraft 3 program itself. Given the difficulty of finding, installing, and then playing any of these mods, and the fact that the players had to own Warcraft already, it was tough for any of them to break out into anything like mainstream popularity. For the most part, they were all niche communities. Dota All-Stars would be the one that broke the mold, and in spectacular fashion. Ginsu proved to have an uncanny talent for zeroing in on what made Dota fun, and then remaking the game to emphasize that aspect. First, he realized that the endless option of heroes, abilities, and items was what allowed hardcore players to spend countless rounds experimenting with new combinations. So Ginsu dramatically increased all of these options. He revamped the progression system to give players a greater sense of reward as the round evolved, while also ensuring that no player could possibly acquire every item by the end of the round. It forced players to choose a strategy from the beginning and stick to it, but be rewarded for it in the process. Ginsu then shifted the game's focus away from fighting against the endless computer-controlled units and towards fighting against other human players. This made Dota All-Stars more of a team versus team game than the other Dota variants, and his instincts were right on the money. As time went by, the audience for Dota All-Stars expanded dramatically, soon dwarfing the player base for every other Dota variant. At the same time, many of these players offered to help on the mod, and soon Ginsu was at the head of a dozen-strong development team. Every one of them was working on their own time for free. That's how much they loved the mod. This had its pros and cons. On the plus side, updates, patches, and bug fixes were frequent, sometimes happening within the same day. On the downside, no matter how hard they worked, no one could change the fact that Dota was a mod inside of somebody else's game. That meant that they couldn't create their own graphics, they couldn't make a matchmaking service, and they couldn't build a tutorial. Effectively, this meant that unless they knew someone who could tell them the rules and help them get better, newcomers were left out to dry. Yet the newcomers kept coming, and in droves. By 2005, barely 2 years since Dota All-Stars began, no less than Blizzard itself chose to host a Dota tournament at their very first BlizzCon event. Blizzard was one of the biggest and most respected game developers in the world, and Warcraft 3 itself was already a tournament staple. For them to take time from their own convention just to show off Dota was unbelievable, but that's how big and how passionate the Dota audience had become. Though numbers for a manually downloaded and community distributed mod are impossible to know, it is estimated that 10 million people have tried Dota All-Stars at one point or another. If those were the numbers for a commercially released studio game, that would be a massive smash hit. Dota did it purely by word of mouth, in a game that could only be played inside of someone else's game. No one factor can explain its popularity, but at its core, Dota is a game that is social, highly competitive, relatively quick, although rounds can go long, strategically complex, fast-paced, and instantly rewarding. That is a devastating combination. All told, Dota is often cited as the most popular mod of all time, considered by some to be even bigger than the legendary Counter-Strike mod for Valve Software's Half-Life. But even as Dota was tearing up BlizzCon in 2005, its world was about to be turned upside down. Ginsu, having put so many hours of his life into the project, chose to pass the torch. Stepping aside, he gave lead development duties to another member of the modding team, who went by the name of IceFrog. Little did anyone know that this would kick off the most intense Dota round of them all, as the fan-driven mod would soon explode into big money for big companies, with all the legal problems that come with it. Tune in next time to see Dota become a battleground. Defense of the Ancients All-Stars was the culmination of a long line of mods, going all the way back to the StarCraft mod Aeon of Strife. It mixed the perspective and controls of a real-time strategy game with the feel and mechanics of an action game, all wrapped in a competitive multiplayer environment. Despite being a fan-made offshoot of the popular Warcraft 3 from Blizzard Entertainment, Dota soon became a phenomenon, one of the most played mods of all time. But it was all a volunteer effort made by enthusiasts. It had never been a commercial product. It would take the industry a few years to recognize the power of this new genre, but once they did, the little mod became one of the hottest and most contentious movements in modern gaming history. In 2005, the developer who brought Dota to prominence chose to pass the torch. Steve Feek, who went by the name Ginsu, handed over lead developer duties to fellow modder IceFrog. While Ginsu had done a stellar job of zeroing in on exactly what made Dota fun, his efforts still didn't feel like a finished experience. The game was not optimized, meaning it took forever to load, and certain characters were far more powerful than others. It was IceFrog who turned Dota into a beautifully balanced machine. Under IceFrog's leadership, Dota soon acquired a level of polish normally reserved for AAA commercial products. The massive boom in active players largely happened under IceFrog's watch, and in the minds of many Dota fans, it is he who is the true hero of the genre. Indeed, Dota under IceFrog simply became too big to ignore. Not only was the player base estimated to be in the millions, but had continued its growth over several years, long after most mods fade away. Eventually, professional developers wanted to take a crack at a genre that was simply synonymous with the game that invented it. While it was never written down in words, the Dota genre was effectively defined by 5 basic principles. The player controlled a single character, that character leveled up as the match progressed, the match consisted of 2 opposing teams, the objective of the match was to destroy the other team's base at the opposite end of the map, and weaker computer-controlled characters would constantly spawn and attack the enemy base. So it was that in 2009, a number of studios released or announced projects that conformed to all of these principles. In April, Gas Powered Games released Demigod. Demigod took the basic Dota formula and added in much slicker graphics. Unfortunately, Gas Powered found that they couldn't replicate the success of IceFrog. Demigod was a commercial flop. This may have had something to do with the fact that on release, the multiplayer didn't actually work, which is bad for a multiplayer-only game. Whoops. But then in October, a game released that got it all right down to its ambitious business model. In terms of gameplay, Riot Games' League of Legends clearly aped Dota to a T, but did so with a passion and quality that equaled the original mod. This was no coincidence, as Riot had actually hired Ginsu as a designer early in the process. The game had a somewhat more cartoony look, leading some to think that Riot was trying to skew its audience young. But the real standout was the game's price point. Nothing. Anybody could make an account, download the game, and play it to their heart's content, free of charge. If players wanted to, they could spend years playing the game without paying a cent. Of course, they could only play as one of a small rotating set of characters. If the character they wanted to play wasn't in that set, then they could choose to pay a small fee for that character. And that was it. The idea was to go for volume by effectively giving the core product away, but then cleaning up on ancillary sales from a massive player base. By all indications, this risky model has been a runaway success. While Riot has never disclosed its revenues, Business Insider estimated that they made anywhere from $25 to $50 million in 2010, stunning for an unknown startup with a free game in its first year. Over time, League of Legends would grow to rival the original Dota as the most popular entrant in the genre. But what is that genre called? Riot has offered an alternative name to distinguish between the original game and the genre. Riot wants it to be known as Multiplayer Online Battle Arena, or MOBA. Obviously, Ginsu's involvement with League of Legends gave it a certain legitimacy with longtime fans. But the same month that it released, a separate announcement came from Dota's current developer. In October 2009, IceFrog publicly stated that he'd been hired by no less than the legendary Valve Software, makers of the hugely popular Half-Life, Left 4 Dead, and Portal franchises. And while he didn't say what he'd been hired for, he did say that it was good news for Dota fans. Immediately, rumors of a Valve-made Dota game, or MOBA game, ran rampant. But Valve, true to their nature, said nothing. But the industry wasn't done with the Dota genre yet, or they weren't done with the MOBA genre yet. Anyway, in May 2010, S2 Games released Heroes of Newerth. It stuck very closely to the original mod, right down to the art direction. It was a continuation of their earlier franchise, Savage, which was also set in Newerth and was also a twist on the strategy genre. Heroes of Newerth made decent if not stellar numbers, selling 200,000 copies in a week at $30 a pop. Still, they had far more players when it was in its free beta stage. Worse, their primary competitor was Riot Games' League of Legends, which was free. Newerth always struggled to gain attention from Legends, finally going free-to-play itself in July 2011. While its player base remains considerably smaller than Legends, it does have a dedicated following of its own. But in July 2010, S2 found itself at the center of the first major scandal of the Dota world, or the MOBA world. Steve Mescon, who had for years run the community website for Dota All-Stars under the name Pendragon, chose to close the site down. In his final post on the site, he claimed that Dota's current developer, IceFrog, had secretly worked with S2 Games to help them make Heroes of Newerth. Pendragon was so upset by this, he wanted to distance himself from IceFrog and Dota forever. However, he never said why this was such a bad thing, especially since IceFrog had publicly announced he was working for Valve anyway. It is worth mentioning here that, by this time, Pendragon was working for Riot Games on League of Legends. S2 has only said no comment about the situation, but it appears unlikely that IceFrog would have worked for S2 in secret because there's really no reason for him to have kept it secret. Either way, the incident made plain that there was quite a bit of tension between the original Dota team and also between Riot and their competitors. As it turned out, this would only be the beginning. Meanwhile, a shooter released on Xbox Live Arcade. Monday Night Combat from Uber Entertainment hoped to take the art style of Valve's Team Fortress 2 and map it onto a third-person perspective. How does this relate to Dota? Well, the gameplay revolved around teams trying to destroy a static enemy structure deep on their side of the map, while computer-controlled bots would spawn on each side. Aha! While it wasn't magic-themed and the perspective was a little different and it had guns, it nevertheless had all the elements to make it a Dota game, or a MOBA game. It proved that the genre had a broader appeal than just its setting, and Monday Night Combat went on to be a success, later coming to Valve's Steam platform on the PC. As something that came from the fans themselves, the genre was thriving, even if nobody could agree on what to call Dota or MOBA. The original mod still saw huge numbers, and League of Legends was slowly growing into a juggernaut. But in October 2010, Valve would finally unveil what they'd been working with IceFrog on. And in doing so, they would ignite the simmering tensions within the Dota community into a conflagration. Tune in next time to see Dota reach the big time. By the end of the 2000s, the fan-made Dota mod was becoming an industry buzzword. After slowly growing in popularity for years, it reached a million-strong player base by the time commercial studios even started experimenting with it. But soon, a number of games across a range of styles and business models released, proving that the mod had now become its own genre, called MOBA by some, and by others, just Dota. During this time, the developers of the original mod were hired by various studios, all working on their own new versions of the game. Before long, some of the biggest names in the gaming world were trying to cash in on the craze, and in so doing, went head-to-head with themselves. In October 2009, the current developer of the Dota mod, IceFrog, announced that he'd been hired by mega developer Valve Software. A year later, on October 13, 2010, Valve formally announced that they were making Dota 2, a project headed by IceFrog himself. While seemingly a pretty simple statement, it brought with it lots of questions. First of all, unlike other genre games like League of Legends or Heroes of Newerth, the Valve game would be taking its name right from the original mod. As a matter of fact, Dota 2 promised to be the exact same as the mod. While Valve would obviously put in their own custom graphics with their source engine, the heroes, items, maps, and gameplay would all be the very same as the mod IceFrog had been perfecting for years. It was, in fact, an extension of the old Valve philosophy of buying popular mods. Counter-Strike, Day of Defeat, and Team Fortress were all fan-made games that Valve had brought into their own portfolio. Interestingly, Dota 2 marked the first time that Valve had ever worked on a project that wasn't a first-person shooter. Even Portal, a puzzle franchise, still involved a gun from the first-person perspective. However, on the exact same day that Valve announced Dota 2, an anonymous blogger made a post about IceFrog. Claiming to be a Valve employee, the poster blasted IceFrog for being impossible to work with, for being arrogant, and for ruining Valve. The same post also claimed to know for certain that IceFrog had indeed worked with S2 Games on Heroes of Newerth, an older accusation that had never been confirmed. Valve later claimed that the post was an outright fake, and indeed, no evidence has ever emerged to support the blogger's claims. In fact, all indications are that IceFrog has become a leading employee at Valve. If nothing else, the post proves that there's quite a bit of anger and animosity boiling in the greater Dota community. Regardless, the Dota genre, or the MOBA genre, pressed on. And it wasn't done conquering the big names yet. Not content with merely Valve, Dota then impressed no less than the legendary Blizzard Entertainment. Of course, Blizzard's Warcraft 3 was the game Dota had spun off from in the first place. After watching their own community play Dota for years, Blizzard announced at their own BlizzCon 2010 that it was finally time to take a crack at it themselves. Blizzard Dota would feature popular characters from across the Blizzard universe, while sticking pretty close to the original gameplay. It too would be a mod, but of their own StarCraft 2. Of course, being Blizzard, no release date was given. But fan reaction was electric. Meanwhile, the Dota genre was also busy crossing oceans. Realm of the Titans released in China in October 2010, bringing the game type into one of the fastest growing gaming markets in the world. The game has become a success in China and is currently in open beta for Western audiences. A full Western release is expected soon. Going into 2011 then, the Dota genre seemed poised to reach the big leagues. Then in July of that year, Riot Games announced that it already had. They stated that their League of Legends game now had 1.4 million players per day and 15 million accounts total. Not long after, they announced that their second tournament season would feature $5 million in prizes, the biggest cash pool in esports history. In other words, League of Legends was doing better than anyone had imagined. This trend continued in August 2011 when Valve hosted the first Dota 2 international tournament at that year's Gamescom in Cologne, Germany. Valve brought together 16 pro-level Dota teams to play competitive Dota 2, a game that none of them had ever touched before, confirming once and for all that the sequel would really just be the original mod reskinned. The cash pool for this tournament was $1.6 million, for a game that hadn't even been released yet. This tournament was also the first time Dota 2 had ever been shown to the public. Now that's a reveal. But while everyone else was celebrating the genre, Blizzard was having issues with it. That same month, they announced that they had flattened the Blizzard Dota project, meaning that they were starting over from scratch. The problem they were finding was endemic to the genre. It had a brutally steep learning curve that was unforgiving to newcomers. Blizzard's core philosophy has always been to make games that are easy to access but difficult to master. Dota was just plain difficult. 2 months later, Blizzard revealed a new trailer for their revamped game that went for a much sillier tone and feel, possibly indicating that Blizzard Dota will be a more casual experience. Being Blizzard, no release date was given, although it claimed it was coming soon. Ish. For their part, Valve is also aware of the difficult nature of Dota. However, since their game is a standalone product, not a mod, Valve will be able to include tutorials and matchmaking in their game. What's more, Valve wants to harness the incredibly passionate Dota player base to help newcomers. How exactly they'll implement this is currently unknown, but it appears that Valve will be giving some kind of in-game rewards to experienced players who help newbies. Whether the notoriously elitist Dota player base will respond to this remains to be seen. But during this whole process, Valve quietly did something that set off the entire rest of the community. They filed for a trademark on the word Dota. Immediately, Steve Mescon, who had run the Dota community website for years under the name Pendragon, filed a countersuit. His claim was that the word Dota was created by, and thus belonged to, the fans themselves. No corporation could lay claim to it. The fear was that if Valve got the trademark, they could shut down the original mod, or at least force it to change its name. Valve did not respond. But a short while later, no less than Blizzard confirmed that they were opposed to the trademark filing, and said they had been in contact with Valve over the matter. Of course, with trademark in hand, Valve could shut down Blizzard Dota as well, or at least force a rename. To date, Valve has not rescinded the filing. Indications are that Blizzard absolutely do not want anyone, including Valve, to have a trademark, but are trying as hard as they can to settle the matter amicably out of court. But if Valve continues to push ahead, there is a possibility that things could get ugly between two of gaming's most beloved companies. Time will tell. As it stands, Valve's move implies that ownership of the Dota name belongs to IceFrog, who has been the lead developer on the original mod for years. Since IceFrog works for Valve, Valve owns the name. But the name originally comes from Modder Eel, who made the first version of the mod, who then passed it on to Ginsu, who now works at Riot Games with Pendragon, and only later passed it to IceFrog. Who has ownership here? Does anybody? And what's more, does the fact that Dota was originally a fan-made spin-off of a Blizzard product give any ownership to Blizzard? This is the legal nightmare of Dota. The tensions within the developer community, including the numerous unconfirmed accusations against IceFrog, might well be wrapped up in this as well, especially with Pendragon's countersuit against Valve, and by extension, IceFrog. Remember, Pendragon abandoned the Dota community site over disagreements with IceFrog. Hopefully this will all be settled peacefully, but if not, it has the potential to become a landmark case in trademark law. Stay tuned. In the meantime, still more games in the genre are coming out. Petroglyph Games' Rise of Immortals released on Valve's Steam platform in September 2011, although it received unfavorable reviews. Hi-Rez Studios has announced Smite, a Dota game notable for using the Unreal 3 engine in a Greek mythological setting. Uber Entertainment will follow up their successful Monday Night Combat with Super Monday Night Combat, a PC-only free-to-play game that promises to be a more traditional Dota game, or MOBA game, or action RTS game, as Valve now wants to call the genre. And of course, Valve's Dota 2 and Blizzard's Blizzard Dota are both expected this year. But through all the legal battles, the commercial interest, and the business models, whether you call it Dota or MOBA or Action RTS, the original mod presses on, still being lovingly perfected by IceFrog even as he works on Valve's game. Even with professional products on the market for free, the Warcraft 3 mod still boasts millions of players. There have been popular mods before, but rarely have any created their own new genres that are worth so much money. In its own way, the Dota mod has become the fans' way of giving back to the medium they love, and an inspiration for upcoming game makers everywhere. All from a couple of guys who just like to play.